the next two things I'd like to talk about is class. I mean, we need to talk about how you see class. Before that, I want to reach out to you three with this question of embarrassment. I think embarrassment in activism is sometimes something that is another gorilla in the room. And I think New York, I can imagine there's a lot of activists. San Francisco is a very small town. And of course, a lot of activists here as well. And later on in the conversation, I want to get into, does our activism at times devalue our work as we get into work for hire? And I really want to hear about, Eric to some degree too, with what they do with Keith. I'd like to start, and if I could, 2006 was the time where you started to, move into this activist world. Were there moments, or are we still in the process? And can you address this idea of embarrassment? Or is that not the case with you, Eric? Maybe we can start with you. Is this a process you had to go through, or do you struggle with that as well?
Well, for me, it started with my own, I think for a lot of us, my own class roots. But my moment of awakening was February 15th, 2003. As you may recall, I was fortunate enough to earn some scholarships to be able to study abroad. So I was living in Italy at the time, and which was a completely new exposure for me, having only lived, growing up working poor in a working class family, first generation college student, not really traveling abroad much. So it was my first time in Europe. And it was, as we all may recall, that was the time, the build up to the invasion to Iraq. In February, the reason why I remember February 15th is this is still to this day, the largest peace demonstration this planet has ever seen. And I was fortunate enough to be there in Rome with 2 million other people at that time, and demonstrating our wish for peace. And so that was, for me, the first time of out of the classroom into the streets opportunity. And so for me, I felt lucky to have that experience in such a large community in a foreign land as a foreigner, and even as an American, where a lot of folks were, because we had already invaded Afghanistan, we were getting a lot of warnings, don't travel, a lot of anti-Americanism going on from our university who we were traveling with. And I properly ignored it and traveled quite a bit and learned a lot. But it was that moment in Rome, for me, that I always feel like those moments of solidarity are what launched me to be able to really own and want to take my activism out. And this sense of shame, I think we're struggle with that is really declaring our values as an individual and what do we value in society, and being outspoken about that. Most difficult is with the people we're closest to and our friends and family, but it's also we have the opportunity to move things forward and have these types of discussions. So, and luckily for me, that was, I've had my moments like Ben. I headed to New York after college wanting to get more involved and to find an opportunity to make a positive difference in the world with what little resources I had and what I could kind of pull together and leverage my own privilege in that way. And so for me, it's been that peace movement and exposing the realities of war and a small sense of solidarity for our civilians who are suffering those consequences all over the world. Primarily for me, because of my work, it's really profound in Afghanistan, as well as Iraq and Sudan and these other places. So the shame part is, I think, what Ben was talking about, is really practicing and owning our identity as activists and declaring our values in a public way without trying to get categorized and dismissed because we stand up. Because things aren't all right, and they're not going to be until people like us stand up, organize, or do something about it. And that there's that risk, that vulnerability of putting ourselves out there. And I think that's that opportunity. And sometimes we do feel embarrassed because it's not received or it's made fun of, or people try to oppress us because we're just trying to do what little we have with what we got. So I think this is something we challenge, we struggle with, but community is a big important part of that to be able to work through that.
Sure, I got it. Would you like to take it?
Yeah, sure. Yeah. So I would say that I began my activism during the anti-globalization movement in 2000, 2001. Living in Toronto, Canada. I'm going to art school, kind of like an old school, kind of based on Bauhaus tradition art school. and organizing to take buses out to Quebec City to demonstrate. And I was really involved, and of course after that I missed Seattle, but went to OAS and all sorts of other places for the World Trade Organization in Washington, D.C. And so this was really the first time that I found this kind of community that really shared with me these ideals that I had as a young artist, activist, and shared it on a larger scale. So it wasn't just based in my city, but all over the place. Now coming back home, I lived with my folks at the time. I was surprised to have a bit of an actual intervention where my parents had invited some old activist friends from Iran. I'm from Iran, who had participated in the Iranian Revolution, who like sat me down like a poet who had spent years in prison, reduced to making collages because he had no pen, and just sitting down and telling me about how this activism really won't get you anywhere, and that's kind of like maybe the shame of it in a way that I experienced. So it was really interesting for me to then try to struggle through the losses and to then really understand the importance of looking at victories in order to move forward and kind of learn from and build from. And I think this book talks about that quite a bit. And for example, with the Occupy movement that occurred recently, how we looked at what was happening in the Middle East and Egypt and the Arab Spring, and how that could kind of bring back the conversation to a longer history, perhaps.
Interesting. An intervention.
Yeah.
It's like, it's art and politics thing.
Jesse, would you like to take some too?
Sure. When I was in my early 20s, I actually worked in politics for a few years. And I went right out of college to Washington, D.C. and kind of worked in the political trenches. And then I left that world behind. It was a great experience for me, and I really believed in the people I was working with. But I left it, and I went to work in film in New York. And I sort of left politics behind for a long time. Although I had apprenticed for a very left-wing filmmaker whose work I really admired, Barbara Koppel, who'd done great films about the labor movement in the United States, really deeply inspirational work. And that was, there was definitely a political affinity with her work, but the work I did as a young filmmaker was not activist work. It wasn't, in fact, it was kind of anti-political. It was really kind of small-scale, humanist, character-driven filmmaking. And the politics were, to the extent there were any, were very implicit in the work. But 2006 was actually a very formative year for me politically, because we were in the midst of the Iraq War, and it was going so poorly, and I was, like most Americans, struggling to understand how we'd gotten to this deeply fucked up place. And I learned about this Iraq War simulation that the Army was running in the Mojave Desert, and I thought, this is bizarre, and maybe this will help me make sense of this colossal disaster in Iraq. And I went out there to make this film, and it really was politicizing for me, and it was the first time I'd really actively engaged with a really huge political issue head on. And at the same time, the film is frustrating, I think, for some people, because it's sort of oblique in its politics still. It's very small scale, and it's portrait of these people, and doesn't wear its position so clearly. And that was very frustrating. For example, when we premiered the film in Berlin, we were booed because I think the audience wanted a very clear statement of where do you stand on this issue. And nonetheless, it was politicizing for me, and I think scalding, actually, because I'd never really kind of gone out and I'd been politically active, as I said, when I was younger, but never really kind of put anything on the line myself. And so, but it hasn't turned me away from kind of engaging with what I think are, the important issues of our time. But it's, I wouldn't say turn me into an activist necessarily. I didn't address the point of embarrassment. I have a very low embarrassment threshold, I'll say that, which is why I like to be behind the camera,
I understand. I do too.